And we began with this breaking news that federal indictment against music mogul Sean Diddy Combs was just unsealed. And it lays out multiple charges against him, including racketeering, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, Combs was arrested overnight by federal agents at a Manhattan hotel. He will appear in court this morning. And according to a source familiar with the situation, Combs was caught off guard by the arrest. But it comes after a year's worth of accusations against Combs, many laid out in lawsuits, including sexual misconduct, sex trafficking, and even distribution of illegal narcotics and firearms. His lawyers said in part he is an imperfect person, but he is not a criminal, and that they will fight these charges with all of his might and the full confidence of his lawyers. Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, NBC Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, and defense attorney Misty Maris. All right, Lisa, obviously this was just unsealed, sealed, a 14-page indictment, a lot in here. What more do we know about the charges and the allegations here?
So, Anna, we know a number of things about the allegations, but I want to highlight a few things for you. One, today's indictment is solely against Sean Combs. But of course, the chief count is a racketeering conspiracy that alleges that Sean Combs used his businesses and a number of people that worked in and around him to essentially facilitate a commercial sex enterprise through which women were trafficked both internationally and interstate to serve his own sexual desires, including by pairing them, once they were plied with drugs he provided, with commercial male sex workers, then watching them and filming them have sexual intercourse with these people, and then to recover, then giving them forced IV fluids in a pattern that lasted between 2009 up through and including 2024. So there's an allegation here about who was involved in this enterprise beyond Sean Combs, and that includes security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees who are engaged in that pattern that I just referred to with you, which the indictment refers to as a freak-off. The other thing I want to tell our viewers is that there is a victim here who's identified as victim one. There's also a separate victim who's not identified by a victim name and number, who is the victim of that transportation to engage in prostitution count. So there's at least two women here that the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York knows about and apparently has interviewed. And the third thing that I would just underscore for you is, in addition to the criminal penalties that Sean Combs could be facing, there are forfeiture allegations, which basically suggest that Sean Combs should give up any and all property, real and personal, that was derived from the proceeds he obtained from this long-standing alleged racketeering conspiracy. So look for the feds to seize property from Sean Combs, and at the end of this case, when and if it reaches its end, to insist that they can seize real property, bank accounts, and otherwise that are obtained for him through this enterprise.
So 3 counts specifically: racketeering, conspiracy. Count 2 is sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. Count 3 is transportation to engage in prostitution. And you laid out many of the details and the allegations that back up each of those counts. I do want to read one quote that is quite disturbing, but I think gives you a greater sense of what was going on here. And it reads, "For decades, Sean Combs, the defendant, abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice." So, Lisa, does this mean other people could face charges beyond Sean Combs?
It does, or it means that other people may already be cooperating with prosecutors in their building of a case against Sean Combs. One thing, Anna, that I want to also highlight for you is that this would not be possible without a change in New York civil law called the Adult Survivors Act. That is what allowed people like Cassie Ventura, who is one of Sean Combs' alleged victims, to bring civil lawsuits suing him for their abuse. Many of those allegations undergirded the Southern District of New York's investigation here, and some of those find echoes in this criminal indictment. So you see the reverberations of the Me Too movement empowering women to come forward, sue civilly, and then seeing federal authorities then transform them into some of the details we see in today's indictment.
And let's listen to Sean Combs' lawyer heading into court this morning. We have a clip.
This is what we've been expecting since the searches in March. He, to his great credit, he voluntarily came to New York. Not a lot of defendants do that. He came to New York to basically engage the court system and start the case.
So it sounds like, or he implies, that he came here anticipating these charges were going to be happening. Would it make sense that they'd be given a heads up?
It might make sense. A lot of defendants, particularly in cases like this, would rather surrender voluntarily and avoid being arrested and cuffed in a public situation and then perp walked, so to speak, through a federal courthouse. It may be that Sean Combs and his lawyers understood that this was about to happen, and therefore they arranged for a more quiet, voluntary arrest. That having been said, Mark Agnifilo, who's the lawyer who you just showed, when he says these are the charges we expected, I can't imagine that even the best criminal defense attorney could have expected the broad panoply of allegations in this indictment, which is one of the most hideous criminal instruments I have ever seen in my years of being a lawyer and also working on this network as a correspondent.
And Julia, I am struck by the fact that it was Homeland Security investigations that carried out the arrest last night, according to WNBC, our local affiliate here in New York. What does that suggest?
Yes, it was Homeland Security investigations. It was also Homeland Security investigations that earlier this year in March conducted warrants that they got from the Southern District of New York to seize electronics from his properties in Miami and Los Angeles. And at the time, I would go to sources that falls within Department of Homeland Security and say, why is this HSI, not FBI? Well, HSI does a lot with human trafficking. And also this international element was coming up. This was a big question we weren't able to answer until right now when this indictment was unsealed. And that's the fact that there's an international component that Lisa talked about, that the trafficking was not just interstate, that there were people coming in from outside of the country. And that's something we might hear of more, when prosecutors bring this forward, as we hear of how he did this. Another thing I wanted to point out was the narcotics piece. I spoke to a former HSI agent just this morning who talked about trafficking. The definition is using force, fraud, or coercion. And very often that is through narcotics. You can get someone addicted to drugs. You can find someone who's addicted to drugs and completely manipulate their behavior and keep them coming. There were other ways he also used force, fraud, and coercion, not only just getting people into an altered state to perform these sexual acts, but also by tracking their whereabouts, by controlling their careers, their finances. He had people who would come in and use these videos that people they were videotaped in these sexual acts they didn't know about, and they would use those as blackmail. So time and time again, you see how he uses force, fraud, and coercion really in a psychological way to keep these victims on the hook. That's something that HSI was tracking from the very beginning, and like Lisa points out, came to light because of the allegations from former sexual partners of Combs.
And Misty, what's your reaction to what we're learning in this indictment?
First of all, these horrible allegations, but something that I want to focus and emphasize is that we're talking about videotapes referenced in this indictment. And we know that Diddy's homes were raided. So it's likely to be the electronic footprint here is going to be central to the prosecution's case and is likely to be significant and evidence that's going to help the prosecution as this case pushes forward. Remember, once those electronic devices are obtained by the government, they're searched. That could lead to additional searches. That could lead to speaking to certain potential victims or witnesses or others who are involved in the criminal enterprise. As Lisa said, there's others who are referenced, but we have not been indicted. Maybe they're cooperating. We don't know. But those electronics and what was obtained, especially in light of what was just pointed out, that much of the force, fraud, and coercion that was used to keep these individuals in Diddy's sphere was related to electronic videotapes and other electronic evidence that was obtained. So that is certainly going to be something that's going to move the needle forward for the prosecution.
And according to this indictment, among the things they seized at his properties when they conducted that search warrant in March of this year at his Miami property, his Los Angeles, California property, they say they seized firearms and ammunition, including 3 AR-15s with defaced serial numbers, as well as a drum magazine. The defaced serial numbers, Misty, catches my eye. Does that suggest other charges, perhaps gun charges, could be coming, or is that already weaved into this indictment?
So this is all part of that criminal enterprise relating to basically, there's a meeting of the minds between these conspirators to engage in criminal conduct. But certainly there could be other gun-related charges that could come down the pike against Diddy or others that were involved, especially when you're talking about the amount of firearms referenced and the fact that serial numbers were scratched off. There's specific charges relating to those. So certainly that could be something that comes down the road.
His lawyers hope he would be released ahead of his next court appearance, Misty, because he voluntarily came to New York, as they described it, and they try to, paint this picture of someone who's cooperating with investigators or with prosecution here. Is it likely that he would be released?
That's going to be central to the argument. The factors that the judge takes into consideration is somebody a flight risk. What is the nature of the allegations? Is there a prior criminal record? Certainly, I believe that his lawyers strategically presented him to say, you don't have anything to worry about, Judge. He's going to appear for these conferences moving forward. He's not a flight risk. And that's going to be central to their argument. Whether or not he gets released is very much in the judge's discretion. With the severity of these allegations, it's possible he could be held.